This is the most inbred family ever documented in modern America, and the man who holds it all together can't explain why he's the only one who can speak. Some stories don't start with a crime, a miracle, or a breakthrough. Some begin in silence in a broken down shack deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where generations of isolation twisted a family tree into a loop. This is the true story of Elias Whitmore, the only vocal member of what the internet now calls the most disturbing family in the U.S. Hidden from the world for decades, the Whitmores lived without schools, doctors, or even birth records until one photograph turned their haunted lives into a global obsession. But what happens when the world stops watching in this chilling true horror story? We explore bloodlines, abandonment, and a man left to carry a legacy written in DNA. Not destiny, real family mystery, inbred family America, Appalachian secrets. You won't believe this. Some people are born into fame, others into poverty, but Elias Whitmore was born into something far more unsettling, an ancient silence written in blood. Not history. Deep in the forgotten hills of Odd, West Virginia, where time decays and maps blur, lived a family so isolated, so genetically entangled, that their existence defies logic and their story feels more horror than human. They didn't choose to be hidden. The world just never came looking. Until one day, it did. And the man standing at the center wasn't a scientist, a preacher, or a villain. He was the only one who could speak. This is where his role begins, not as a leader, but as a bridge. And to understand how Elias became the voice of a family trapped in generations of silence, we need to go back to the roots. He wasn't born rich. He wasn't born poor. He was born into something the world still can't fully explain. Elias Whitmore came into this world not with a scream, but into a silence older than memory, into a family so removed from time, so deeply entangled by blood, that their story would one day shock millions. He wasn't a victim of poverty or privilege, but of a pattern one passed down like a whispered curse across generations of isolation, hidden deep within the forgotten hollows of West Virginia, far beyond paved roads or school buses. Elias's birth wasn't just another life. It was another echo in a loop of ancestry that had no exit. This wasn't just a rural family, it was a living anomaly, shaped not by chance but by genetic inevitability. And yet, from the very start, Elias was different. While others barked, he listened. While others drifted, he saw. While others stayed locked in bodies that refused to speak, he carried the weight of all their silence. What made him different? What made him the only one who could understand a world the rest of his family had never been allowed to enter? To answer that, we have to go back not just to his birth, but to the very roots that shaped it. This isn't just a family tree, it's a circle with no way out. In most families, bloodlines branch outward, creating new roots, new names, new chances. But in the Whitmore lineage, something went wrong horribly, quietly wrong, generation after generation. Cousins married cousins, and siblings became something more. The boundaries between brother, sister, wife, and husband blurred until the family wasn't expanding. It was folding inward, tightening like a knot that no one could untangle. In the remote hills of Appalachia, isolation wasn't just a condition, it was a law, a way of life, a trap. Without schools, churches, or outside contact, the Whitmores did what they thought they had to do, survive with who was available. And so they turned inward again, And again and again. Children were born not just from love, but from necessity, habit, and confinement. Over time, the DNA that once offered diversity became a closed loop. Elias Whitmore was born into that loop, into a name that carried not just heritage, but weight that twisted not only his family's bodies, but their very place in the human story. And this twist, this genetic spiral, didn't begin with him. It began long before, with 2 brothers and one irreversible choice. In a family of 15, only one could speak, and that made him responsible for everything. Elias Whitmore was born the middle child in a house of chaos, 15 brothers and sisters, each marked by something no doctor had ever seen, no school had ever classified, and no state had ever acknowledged. Some never made eye contact. One barked like a dog when confused. Another giggled uncontrollably when in pain. Most never spoke at all. The home echoed not with language, but with sounds that had no translation, grunts, stares, fragmented gestures. But Elias was different. From an early age, he listened, he watched, he made sense of a world his siblings could only feel. And one day, almost without anyone noticing, he started speaking not just words, but thoughts. And in that moment, the silence that had blanketed the family for generations cracked. Not enough to save them, just enough to choose him. Because in families like this, the one who speaks becomes the one who carries. Elias didn't just grow up, he became the voice, the translator, the filter between his family and the outside world they feared. And in doing so, he inherited not just their trust, but their weight. And that weight would only grow. He didn't ask to become the voice of a forgotten bloodline, he just happened to be the only one who could speak. In a family sealed off from the world for nearly a century, Elias Whitmore became the accidental translator of a language built from silence, stares, and sounds that haunted more than they explained. He wasn't the oldest, the strongest, or the most prepared, but he was the one the outside world would come to fear, misunderstand, and obsess over, soft-spoken, mud-stained, and unshakable. Elias stood at the doorway between the holler and the headlines, but to truly understand how he became that bridge, we need to go beyond the crumbling porch and deeper into the blood itself. He didn't volunteer to face the world, but the world kept knocking, and he was the only one who could answer. Elias Whitmore never asked to be the spokesperson of a family the internet would one day call the most inbred in America. But in a collapsing shack where language had vanished and eye contact was rare, Elias was the only one who could open the door, form a sentence, and make the outside world pause. Not because he was chosen, not because he was ready, but because no one else could. While his brothers barked and his sisters rocked in silence, Elias learned to track tone, to decode body language, to speak not just in words, but with presence. He didn't smile much, he didn't invite questions, but he didn't flinch either. To the mailman, the census taker, the social worker who never returned, Elias was the quiet figure who nodded, signed, translated, and closed the door again. He became the reluctant interface between 2 universes, his family's and everyone else's. And he did it without knowing he was performing a miracle. Because in a place where no one expected to be understood, Elias made it impossible to look away. And now that the world had looked, it would never see him the same again. But the truth, it didn't start with him. It started generations before. You can't understand Elias Whitmore by looking at poverty, you have to look at his blood. On the surface, The Whitmore family seemed like just another story of rural neglect. No plumbing, no electricity, no school records, no medical files. But to stop there is to miss everything. This wasn't about poverty. It was about isolation so deep, so generational, that it rewired the very concept of family. In the hills of Odd, West Virginia, distance didn't just separate them from society, it became their identity. For over a century, the Whitmores lived in a loop. No new names, no new blood, only repetition, generation after generation, folding the same DNA inward like an echo that never fades. And Elias, he wasn't born outside that echo. He was born right in the center of it. The miracle wasn't that he survived the poverty. The miracle was that he emerged coherent from a closed system designed to collapse. Understanding Elias means facing an uncomfortable truth sometimes. The consequences we label as strange or broken aren't created by individuals, they're built by systems we chose not to see. And that system didn't begin with Elias. It began decades before with two brothers, one hollow, and a pattern no one stopped. It didn't start with a crime, it started with two brothers and a bloodline that folded in on itself. In the late 1800s, deep in the wooded spine of Appalachia, twin brothers Henry and Jonah Whitmore unknowingly set off a slow, irreversible spiral. What began as survival, two families living off the land, isolated from town, church, and census, turned into something far more insidious over time. Their children didn't marry strangers. They married each other's children, not once, not by accident, but again and again. This wasn't ordinary cousin marriage. It was double cousin lineage, the offspring of twin brothers marrying into the same narrow bloodline on both maternal and paternal sides. Genetically, it created an echo chamber DNA folding over itself until mutations weren't anomalies, they were expectations. In science, this level of consanguinity collapses diversity and magnifies recessive traits. In real life, it created the Whitmores. By the time Elias was born, the damage had already compounded through generations. He didn't inherit a family tree. He inherited a loop closed, unbroken, and increasingly unstable. This wasn't folklore. This was biology left unattended, and the consequences wouldn't just live in his siblings' faces or movements. They would shape his role, his burden, and eventually his legacy. By the time Elias was born, the damage wasn't just visible, it was built into the blueprint. This wasn't a family struggling to survive. It was a bloodline unraveling in slow motion, generation after generation. What science calls genetic drift, the Whitmores lived as daily reality. Bent limbs, blank stares, voices that never formed. But this spiral didn't stop with birth, it got worse with every name added to the family line. And in the middle of it all stood Elias, a child born into a world where fate was already sealed, long before he took his first breath. To understand his place in the story, we need to look closer, not just at his name, but at the parents who gave it to him. Because what they shared wasn't just love. They shared the same grandparents. They didn't just share love, they shared both sides of the same bloodline. Elias Whitmore's parents weren't distant cousins or some footnote in a tangled family tree. They were double cousins, bonded by blood not once, but twice. Both their mothers were sisters. Both their fathers were brothers. That meant Elias's parents shared the same exact set of grandparents, a genetic mirror folded back on itself. In the world of DNA, This level of consanguinity doesn't just increase risk, it weaponizes it. The family tree didn't branch, it curled inward, forming a genetic loop so tight, escape was mathematically impossible. This wasn't just rural isolation, it was biological entrapment. And in this loop, recessive traits weren't buried, they were amplified, dragged to the surface like warnings no one ever heeded. Every child born into that loop faced a future not written in opportunity, but in probability. And when Elias entered the world in 1957, he didn't just carry his parents' last name. He carried the invisible blueprint of every repeated pairing before them. That blueprint would decide who lived, who suffered, and who, like Elias, would be chosen to carry the weight of it all. But the worst part, it hadn't even peaked yet. In most families, genetics is a risk. In the Whitmores, it was a guarantee. For the average unrelated couple, the chance of having a child with a severe genetic disorder sits around 2 to 3%. But in the Whitmore bloodline, those odds didn't just double, they multiplied with each generation. Because this wasn't one isolated case of consanguinity. It was a closed system. A repeating algorithm of DNA where the same genetic material kept looping through the same family line again and again. Every birth wasn't just a child, it was a roll of loaded dice. And after decades of these rolls, the house always won. Autism, intellectual disability, physical deformities, the kinds of traits most families encounter once in a lifetime, became recurring characters in the Whitmore home. And the deeper the bloodline folded into itself, the louder the consequences echoed. Elias was born into this biological collapse, not as a miracle, but perhaps as the statistical outlier, the one who could speak, stand, function. But that didn't make him free. It made him responsible. Because in this family, the ability to understand didn't come with relief. It came with duty. And the weight of that duty was only just beginning. 15 children were born and only one could speak. Was he a miracle? Or the family's punishment? Elias Whitmore entered the world not into a family, but into a spiral one, already tightening with each birth. 15 children. Some didn't survive infancy. Others lived in bodies that never grew into minds. Minds that never found words. Eyes that never truly focused. The house wasn't filled with laughter or lullabies. It was filled with unintelligible sounds, nervous tics, and gestures that no one outside the holler could understand. And then there was Elias. He cried like other babies. He walked, he watched, he spoke, he noticed things. And because he could do all that, because he functioned in ways no one else around him could, he became something rare in a system built to break. Whether that awareness was a blessing or a curse is still up for debate. Was he spared by chance? Or was he built to carry the full weight of a broken legacy, because in a family where every child was born into silence? Elias was the one who would remember it all, and the one who could never walk away. What came next wouldn't be kinder. It would only ask more. What if the horror wasn't hidden in the shadows, but baked into the blood itself by the time Ellis could form full sentences? He was already standing in the middle of a family no one could explain. The signs were everywhere, bodies that moved without pattern, sounds that meant nothing, gazes that wandered past you like ghosts in daylight. These weren't quirks, they were symptoms of something deeper. The consequences weren't cultural, they were coded. And Elias, the only one who could translate that pain into words, was left holding truths too heavy for anyone else to carry. But to understand what that burden looked like, You have to see where he lived and who he lived with. Their bodies told a story no one wanted to hear, and Elias was the only one forced to translate it. In the Whitmore family, trauma didn't whisper it, screamed through twisted limbs, vacant stares, and the eerie repetition of sounds that meant nothing to the outside world. Autism wasn't diagnosed, it was expected. Cognitive delays weren't treated, they were inherited. One child giggled uncontrollably when hurt. Another flinched at shadows, unable to form a single word. These were not outliers, they were patterns. And in the middle of that living archive of genetic consequence stood Elias, the anomaly. He could speak. He could walk into a store. He could understand what no one else in his family could express. But that didn't make him lucky. It made him responsible. Because once you understand pain, you can't ignore it. And Elias understood all of it. He wasn't spared, he was assigned. Not a savior, not a hero, just the one the curse didn't silence. And that silence, thick, ancient, inescapable, was now his to carry. But where do you carry pain that was never yours to begin with? The answer lay in the collapsing house they still called home. This wasn't a mistake. It was a survival system that slowly turned on itself. No one in the Whitmore family set out to break the rules of nature. There was no master plan, no evil intention, just distance, just isolation, just the slow erosion of choice. When you live far enough from society, the outside world stops existing, and the only people left to marry are the ones already carrying your blood. Over time, survival became repetition. Repetition became ritual, and ritual became ruin. They weren't cursed by fate, they were cornered by circumstance. What began as a means to continue life in the holler slowly became the reason life stopped evolving. The same genes looping, the same names repeating, the same traits resurfacing like ghosts that refused to stay buried. Elias wasn't born to fix this. He was born to witness it. Because once a system like this takes root, it doesn't scream for help. It whispers, quietly, through the generations. And those whispers become harder to hear when everyone stops listening. But Elias listened. He had to. And everything he learned would be written not in books, but in the structure of a house that was never meant to last. It wasn't a home, it was a graveyard of time, rot, and memory. The place where Elias Whitmore was raised had 4 walls, but calling it a house would be generous. There was no roof, just a patchwork of tarps and decaying wood, fighting off rain they never fully stopped. No front door, only a blanket nailed to a frame, swaying like a warning. No beds, just piles of mouldy clothes, torn mattresses, and garbage bags stacked like furniture. The smell wasn't something you got used to. It was something that swallowed you whole. It was the scent of damp earth, rotting time, and air that hadn't been fresh in decades. Rodents ran through the floorboards. The windows were broken or boarded. Electricity came from a failing generator Elias fixed every week with scrap and luck. For most people, this would have been condemned. For the Whitmores, it was survival, and in that rotting shelter, surrounded by sounds instead of sentences, Elias became more than a resident. He became a witness to decay that wasn't just physical, it was generational. It was systemic. And it was still alive. The house didn't fail them. The world did. And yet, they stayed. Because there was nowhere else to go. Elias wasn't just surviving with them. He was shielding them from a world that never wanted to understand. Inside that collapsing structure lived the people Elias would never walk away from. Isaac, his brother, didn't speak. He barked, sometimes in fear, sometimes in greeting, always misunderstood. Lorraine, their sister, wandered barefoot through the woods, talking to trees, smiling at shadows that only she could see. Timmy never aged in his mind, though his body grew into a man. His heart and thoughts remained trapped at the age of 6. And then there was Ruth the eldest, the anchor, the one who made a silent vow to their dying mother, never marry, never leave, never abandon what was left. This wasn't just a group of siblings. It was a chain forged by loyalty, silence, and survival. And Elias stood in the middle, not above them, not beyond them, but between them, and a world that would call them cursed, broken, or worse, disposable. He knew how to translate their needs without words, how to calm Isaac's panic, find Lorraine when she wandered too far, protect Timmy from his own confusion. He knew because he had to, because no one else ever would. And that truth, more than the house, more than the blood, is what held him there. He wasn't their leader. He was their spine, the only thing keeping everything from collapsing. Elias Whitmore didn't give speeches. He didn't command attention. But when he spoke, the room quieted, not because his voice was loud, but because it was rare, measured, deliberate. His hands were cracked from winters without gloves, fingers hardened from repairing what others had long abandoned: generators, broken steps, water lines made from garden hoses, and rusted hope. His boots were always muddy, his shirt always stained, but his presence carried more weight than words ever could. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. In a family where most communication came in gestures, echoes, or noise without meaning, Elias became the compass. When the lights flickered, it was Elias who fixed them. When someone cried without knowing why, it was Elias who understood first, not through training, not through education, but through presence, quiet, unwavering, deeply human. He didn't rescue his family. He held them together, day after day, year after year. Not because anyone asked him to, but because no one else could. And the cost of that kind of silence is the kind of weight no one sees until it breaks. He wasn't the face of the family, but when everything fell apart, Elias was the one still standing. After decades in silence, the outside world finally came knocking, not with understanding, but with cameras, curiosity, and chaos. Viral fame brought money, attention, and disaster in equal measure. And in the middle of that storm stood Elias, unchanged, unprepared, and unwilling to leave. But to understand how a man like him endured a spotlight that burned more than it illuminated, we have to look at what happened when truth met exploitation, and what he did when the world turned away. When the world failed his daughter, Elias didn't file a report, he loaded a shotgun. Elias Whitmore never trusted systems, not the law, not the courts, not child protective services that had never once stepped foot in the holler. So when his daughter Sarah came to him shaking, ashamed, and barely able to explain what had happened, he didn't reach for a phone. He reached for the 12 gauge he kept behind the generator. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threats. He walked across the road in silence, knocked once, and stared at the man who had hurt her. No one knows what Elias said, if he said anything at all. But that man left town the same night and never came back. No charges were filed. No names were recorded. But the message was clear. Elias handled his own justice. Not out of rage, but out of certainty that no one else ever would. And for a man raised in a world where no help ever came, action was the only thing that mattered. Not for revenge, but for protection. Because in Elias's mind, survival was never about rules. It was about showing up and making damn sure it never happened again. They lived decades unseen until one photo turned them into a viral phenomenon. It started with a single image, a black and white photo in a quiet documentary project titled Created Equal. Elias was in the background, muddy boots, worn hands, quiet eyes. No one knew who he was. Then came the video, uploaded by a YouTube channel known for exposing America's forgotten corners. The title was Blunt Inbred Family, The Whitmores. And suddenly, the internet couldn't look away. Tens of millions of views, comments flooded in, reactions, donations, conspiracies, hate, pity, awe. The Whitmores had lived decades in near total isolation, unknown to the world until now. But this fame wasn't requested. It wasn't safe. It was invasive, disorienting, and overwhelming. One day they were silent figures in a crumbling house. The next, they were a symbol misunderstood, exploited, dissected. And Elias, the only one who could grasp what was happening, stood still as the digital storm engulfed his family. He didn't ask for this spotlight, but he couldn't stop it either. Because once the internet claims your story, you no longer own it. Even if it was born in silence. Fame gave them a microphone, but it also lit the match. After the video went viral, donations poured in. Over $130,000 was raised through GoFundMe strangers moved by the family's story, hoping to help. But the line between help and harm blurred quickly. When a second follow-up video asked, "Where did the money go?" Ruth, the eldest sister, the quiet protector, looked into the camera and simply said, "I don't know." That moment ignited a wildfire. The internet turned. Comment sections swarmed with accusations, fraud, exploitation, mismanagement. Other YouTubers piled on, demanding accountability. Some blamed the family. Some blamed the filmmaker. Some said it was all a scam from the start. But none of them had ever lived without plumbing. None had ever shared a mattress with 3 siblings. None had ever stood between a howling winter and a paper-thin trailer wall. The internet saw numbers. Elias saw survival. And when the smoke cleared, what should have been a lifeline became another reason for judgment, a storm of digital noise aimed at people who never asked to be known. The money came and went, the fire stayed, and the silence, once protective, became dangerous. The lie wasn't just about death, it was the final nail in trust. In late 2024, the story took a turn no one expected. A heartbreaking post spread across social media. Elias Whitmore had died. His daughter, Sarah, shared the news. Grieving fans reacted instantly. Condolences flooded in, followed by donations. Thousands of dollars were sent to cover funeral costs. People mourned, tributes were made, and then Elias appeared on camera, alive, quiet, confused. The truth unraveled in seconds. Sarah had lied. She later admitted to fabricating the story to raise money, hoping no one would question it. But the damage was done. The fragile trust that had built up between the world and the Whitmores shattered overnight. Supporters felt betrayed. Critics felt vindicated. The filmmaker shut down all donation links. The internet, once moved by compassion, turned cold and cruel. Ruth stopped speaking on camera. Isaac stopped coming outside. Elias, already tired, aged years in weeks. It wasn't just a lie, it was a fracture. A rupture in the one thing holding the outside world and the hollow-together belief. And when belief breaks, so does everything else. What happens to a house when its last pillar crumbles? Elias Whitmore is no longer young. His steps are slower, his silence deeper, but he's still there in the same trailer, next to the same collapsing house, surrounded by the same people the world once called a curse. But Elias never used that word. He called them family. Isaac still barks. Lorraine still wanders. Ruth still keeps the promise she made to their mother, never leave, never forget. And Elias, despite everything, stays. There is no plan for when he's gone. No organization, no government safety net, no foundation. Just a memory of a promise and a silence that grows heavier with time. He is not their leader. He is their last heartbeat. The internet has moved on. Donations have dried. The cameras have stopped rolling. But the Whitmores remain misunderstood, misnamed, but never monsters. They are not villains. They are not saints. They are the echo of choices made long before them. A legacy of isolation, a circle of blood, a consequence, and Elias, even as the light fades, still carries that truth on his back quietly, completely, until the end. If Elias disappears tomorrow, does anyone come knocking? Maybe that's the most haunting part. Not the genetic spiral, not the silence, not even the rotting house. It's the fact that one man has held up an entire legacy unpaid, unthanked, and unseen, and when he's gone, the story risks vanishing with him. But stories like this shouldn't just go viral. They should go remembered. Because Elias isn't just a man in the hills, he's a mirror of what happens when systems fail, of what loyalty looks like when no one's watching, of what love costs when there's no safety net. So if this story made you pause, if it stayed with you even for a moment, don't let it disappear into the algorithm. Drop a comment below and tell us what part hit you hardest. Hit the save button. Share it with someone who still thinks poverty is just laziness. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Because stories like this one, they don't just deserve to be told. They deserve to be heard again and again before the last voice goes silent.